think everyone has heard the term work-life balance. It's a great idea. I think everyone understands that it can help, that it can have an effect on your physical and mental health, that it can have an effect on your relationships, your family life, your friends, your work colleagues, if it's out of kilter. I think we all know that it's something that we should strive towards, but it's something that is not actually as easy as it always sounds. It can be very easy for that to slip and for it to fall out of place. And I think it can also add a lot of pressure, a lot of worry of like, God, I'm not getting this work-life balance right. Like, am I doing enough work? Am I spending enough time at home? Which one, I feel bad for spending more time at home because I haven't got this work done, but then it's not a proper balance. And, and that pressure can build and can sometimes add to the problem. The other thing is that it puts a lot of onus on that person. Well, you've got mental health issues because you didn't get your work-life balance right. You need to take more time off. You need to make sure that you are not working too hard, otherwise your health is going to be affected, or this is why you've got these problems, this is why you're stressed. That's a lot of pressure and responsibility on that person, when sometimes it's very easy for it to come out of kilter without even realizing. I think we assume that having an off-balance mental health and off-balance work-life balance, lots of balances there, means that equals mental health issues. And actually, sometimes it can work the other way. Sometimes once you start with a mental health issue, that work-life balance then goes completely because you find it really difficult to keep on top of things. So it's a bit of both. And I think if you notice someone's work-life balance is changing and they are going to one extreme or another, that is a good sign to check in on that person. Either there is too much pressure coming from an area of their life, which is making that balance off, or they're putting too much pressure on themselves. And if it's coming from them, then there might be other issues, there might be underlying issues, it might be because of anxiety. So think very carefully before you kind of put pressure on someone to fix their work-life balance, because they might be struggling to do that. I want to talk a little bit about my own experiences and how my work-life balance became really out of kilter, and how that had an impact on my mental health, and how my mental health had an impact on it. So I've talked a lot about the fact that I've struggled over the last 10 years, and a lot of my anxiety started when, and which was followed by the depression, when I was doing my PhD. So this was about 10 years ago. And with PhDs, there's a lot of pressure on you to kind of run your own project, do the work. There isn't as much structure. You go from a very structured life of exams and coursework, and this is the time you've got to be in labs, blah, 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 to a PhD, which is often a lot freer. You run your own time, you run your own experiments. There's no real guidelines on how much data you need to pass your PhD. So there is this constant feeling of like, God, I've just got to keep going. I've got to keep working. I've got to get as much data as I possibly can, in case like it's not enough to pass my PhD. I need enough for a thesis. This thesis seems massive, so I need a lot of data. So I must be working all the time, and that pressure can lead to you wanting to not switch off. It can lead to long hours in the lab. It can lead to working at weekends. For me, the hardest bit was when I got to the actual write-up, when I was writing my thesis up. And I really struggled to stop. I'd get up in the morning and I'd sit down at my desk pretty much straight away, and I would be there all day. And then I didn't want to end. I didn't want to go to sleep. I didn't want it to stop, because I just felt like nothing I did was good enough. The writing wasn't good enough. My work wasn't good enough. What I had to write up wasn't good enough. So if I just kept working, if I just kept pushing myself, then somehow I'd make it better. So at that point, there was a lot of, working too hard. And that was something that I took into my postdoc position, which was the research position that I went into after my PhD. And again, I would put a lot of pressure on myself. I didn't feel like I was good enough. I wasn't good enough to be there. I wasn't good enough to be a scientist. And I felt like I was constantly needing to prove myself. So I would work as much as I possibly could to make sure that I could do as much as I could to kind of prove myself. And if I wasn't doing experiments, I was working often till 9, 10 o'clock at night, and then I was working at weekends. I wouldn't want to have a lunch break because that was wasted time. And if I wasn't doing that, then I felt like I needed to be reading papers. Like I have a short-term memory problem alongside my dyslexia, which I constantly feel like I need to compensate for. Like I need to work harder to prove that I'm good enough as everyone around me. So I really struggled to remember things I've read. I struggled to remember like the authors' names, or sometimes the whole concept of an experiment. I might remember the gist of the paper, but maybe not the details. So I felt like I needed to constantly go over and over and over these papers in some sort of hope that eventually it would get into my long-term memory so that I didn't look stupid. Like that was my biggest fear. And I worked and I worked and I worked, and everyone around me was saying like, there's something wrong, you're not right. It was an awful time for me. I became a shell of a person, and eventually I had a breakdown and I had to take a month off work. And I definitely think that a large part of it, not all of it, because there was a lot of other things that were going on. The depression, anxiety had got to another level, but that constant drive to work so hard wasn't helpful, and I wore myself out. I was exhausted physically from working all that time. I wasn't eating properly. I wasn't sleeping because of my anxiety at night, which meant would come in and be doing my long days. I was in at 8, leave like doing 12, sometimes 14-hour days. Like you can't maintain that. And eventually I just burnt myself out. And it is the worst point in my whole life. So when people say, oh, you need to get your work-life balance right, I'm 100% supportive of that. But I already knew that. I knew that before I burnt myself out. And sometimes it's not easy. And, people would say to me, oh, make sure you take a break or make sure you have a holiday. But that anxiety, that guilt to not stop working took over, and I couldn't. And I think what I'd really like to say, if there is anyone that's listening that has manages people or supervises people, or if you're a postdoc that even supervises PhD students, if you see someone working a lot of too hard, if you see that balance changing, tell them that it is okay to take some time off. Encourage them to take a breather. you know, make sure that you've told them that their work is good enough so that maybe they can sort of relax their demon on themselves. Like they can relax that dementor going, you're shit, you're shit, you're shit, for one moment, so that they could have a rest for one day or 1 week. So just be mindful of, sometimes I think it's easy to look at that person and be like, God, they're really driven. You know, they're really working hard. You know, I've told them to take some time off. If they decide not to, then, you know, that's just because they want to work hard. No, it doesn't work just like that. Yeah, they do want to work hard, but that's not necessarily healthy for them. People need time off. People need to take a rest. And that is so much harder when you have the mental health issues going on in your head, when you have your dementor kind of making you not see logic and sense anymore. Before I finish, I also want to talk about the flip side. I think people always think that when your work-life balance goes, especially when it's around mental health issues, that means that you work too hard. But there is another side to that, where you don't work. And I think a lot of people kind of don't necessarily pick that up as easy, because they just think, oh, that person doesn't want to work, they're being really lazy. Well, they clearly are fine. If they can go out and socialise, then there's clearly not an issue. If they can go and spend time with their boyfriend, it's clearly not an issue. You know, if they can, I don't know, go out for dinner or go and visit friends, whatever it is, then it's not an issue. That's not true. And I think it's something that, like, people just are really not aware of. Sometimes when your anxiety particularly gets really bad, depression can stop you from going to work for sure. But I think depression for me made me struggle to be around anyone. But the anxiety, when you become unbelievably anxious, when you struggle to cope with everything, when you struggle with the work, especially, I see this a lot when I've been supervising PhD students around their thesis writing time, for some reason, that everything just becomes a bit too much, and maybe there are so many blurred lines because you're working from home and stuff, that it's easy to run away. It's easy to go, I can't deal with all this work. I've got so much to do. I'm not good enough. Everything I do is wrong. I just can't do it. So I'm not going to. And then what you do is you see, and I've been there, I did this in my PhD. I didn't want to go into work. I didn't want to do my work. I found excuses I was ill. I just didn't come in sometimes. It was, again, a lot easier when you're writing up because people aren't expecting you in. I've seen it with PhD students who haven't turned up for meetings, or constantly making excuses, or stop replying to emails. And it's really easy to get very frustrated and very angry at them, because it's like, well, this is, you know, why are they doing this? You know, they're just, they're always ill, or they're always making an excuse for not done that work, blah, blah, blah. But then I know that they're going out at the weekend, and I know that they're having fun, and I know that they're seeing their friends and their boyfriend. So there clearly isn't a problem. Let me explain something. Anxiety is not logical. I cannot do my work, but I need to be safe. I need to escape from the anxiety. So I would go and do the one thing that made me feel safe, and I would go and see my friends of a weekend. I had an amazing group of friends who were a lot of fun, and we would go out drinking. And this was number 2 great escape. I drank so that I could forget. I drank so it all disappeared, and suddenly I was free. I wasn't anxious anymore. I could have a good time, and then I was surrounded by these people that weren't doing PhDs, that didn't ask me how it was going, that just wanted to have fun with me, and I escaped. And every single weekend I was going out with them and I was getting drunk. And that was my escape. It might have looked like I was having a great time, it might have looked like I was fine, but I wasn't, because that work-life balance had slipped in the other way. My work wasn't getting done, but my social life was still happening. So if you are struggling with your work-life balance, like, don't beat yourself up. Don't put that as an added pressure. Just be aware that it's off, which means there's something going on with you. Either there's something that needs to change at work or at home because it's taking too much of your time. So it's an external change that needs to happen, a conversation with a line manager because you've got too much work, or, you need to, sort of speak to your partner or whatever it is, like, about changing things at home, whatever it, you need to do. Or it's because there's something going on with you that you're starting to struggle, that you're not coping with things, that maybe you're putting a lot of pressure on yourself. And if that's the case, then you need to think about what you can do about it, whether you need to go and get some counselling or therapy. Maybe you need to go to the doctors for some medication. Maybe you just need a holiday to kind of take some time and ground yourself. Maybe you need to just go and do something for yourself for a little while. Whatever it is, just do that so that you can try and get that equilibrium again between the work and life. And if you work with colleagues and you can see, or you live with people, whatever, anyone you care about, anyone you come into contact with, if you see that work-life balance go in, reach out to them, try and find out what's going on and see if there's anything you can do to help them, and maybe encourage them to kind of notice that there's something off and that they need to change it. I hope this has been helpful again.